This is a Spiral Living Skillshare video, and today we are going to learn how to can tomatoes from the garden safely and deliciously. So we're starting with tomatoes that came out of the garden, and the ones that we're using today have been thoroughly washed. You always want to wash and inspect your produce. Dirt is not your friend with canning. I don't mind eating it fresh, but with canning it can create problems later, and we'll talk about that when we talk about pressure canning versus water bath canning. These are a big boy tomato, and as you can see, they are beautifully ripe. The riper they are, the more sugars are going to be in them. We're also inspecting them for any diseases or bad spots. If there's a bruise or a bad spot, we're going to cut that out. Sometimes tomatoes can get a disease called anthracnose, which manifests in little circles that are slightly depressed and have a little dot in the middle. You don't want to can those. Use those for fresh eating. Anthracnose can actually continue to grow in the jar, so it's not something that you want to can. These are a better boy tomato. These are aroma tomato. Aroma tomato is called a paste tomato. It has more meaty tissue compared to watery centers. I use them interchangeably for canning unless I'm specifically making tomato paste. And then I would want to choose a paste tomato because it's going to cook down to thickness faster without getting as overcooked or caramelized flavor. Here's a different selection of tomatoes from my garden. We're going to be using fresh basil today. We're going to be using homegrown garlic from Kate and Kelpie's garden. And then these are some different tomatoes that we grew there. These are an Amish paste tomato. We didn't have a great tomato year. Some of these tomatoes are from my friend's house, but we grow a lot of Amish paste. They're less susceptible to blossom end rot than the San Marzanos. We have good experiences with them. These are small versions of a pink tomato called Roast Burn that has a really nice flavor. I like it a lot. These are Mountain Magic, which is a hybrid tomato that is small but abundant and very disease resistant. The smaller the tomato, the more pectin is going to be in it because the pectin is under the skin, and so it'll thicken more. And so different tomatoes are going to have different uses. But for canning today, we're doing a marinara sauce, and I'll just mix up what types of tomatoes are in there. This one is a black crim. It has the green shoulders. Those green shoulders can sometimes be a little firm and hard, but it tends to have a really nice flavor and a lot of sugars in this tomato. Some canning recipes are going to tell you to put sugar in a tomato sauce. That's to make commercial tomatoes taste like these. You don't want to put sugar in these sauces. They'll be too sweet. Our summer tomato sauces have a great deal of their own sugars in them. So we're going to be using a bunch of different tools today, and I'll be showing those to you as we go along. If you don't have the right tool, you can probably fake it with something that's doing the same thing. And there's a lot of canners in the community, so I'm sure that you can borrow a canning pot and get that job done. The method that I use for my marinara sauce is a roasted tomato method. So what I'm going to do is take these tomatoes that have been thoroughly washed, and I'm just cutting them in half and putting them in the hotel pan. I was a caterer, so I have pans like this. I can loan you some of mine if they come back clean. But you can use a lasagna pan. You can use whatever you've got that can go in the oven. So I cut these up because I want the water to come out of them. Usually the paste tomatoes, I just give it a little slice. Lately I've been cutting these all the way in half because these are such a juicy, watery tomato, and I want to bring that water out. I'm going to save that water and use it in soup stocks. It's delicious. It's so yummy. And sometimes I'll even can the tomato water as tomato stock for a vegetable stock that I can have just on the shelf when I want it. My knives are sharp because I'm a professional, but if your knife is not very sharp and you're struggling with it and you don't have the means to really sharpen it up, use a serrated knife for cutting your tomatoes. It'll break through much more easily, or you can poke them first and then cut where you've poked, and that'll work better. But dull knives are how you get hurt. So we're going to put these in the oven to roast. Now, here's a tip. Always, 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 always look inside the oven before you turn it on. And that'll avoid some real problems in life. So when I look inside this oven, I'm going to find the tomatoes that we've already roasted before Caitlin got here, so that she wasn't going to have to wait so long for filming. So we put these tomatoes into roast. They're at about 375 degrees. These have been in the oven for about an hour and 15 minutes. And as you can see, they've developed some nice caramelizing under the skin. So this is a demonstration-sized batch. I will do larger batches when I'm canning for my family. And the way that I figure about how much I'm going to get is if I put in 2 very full hotel pans to roast, I'll get about 7 quarts of tomato sauce from that. So now I'm lifting them off of the water and I'm putting them in this strainer. I'm going to keep this water and use it, but I'll strain it first of the seeds. And then what I'm going to do with them is I'm going to put them in the blender. So I've got a nice heavy-duty blender going here, and I am going to use homegrown garlic. Again, I have rinsed it, and homegrown basil. Again, everybody got a bath. And some good quality sea salt. And this can be a little bit noisy. It's gonna make a mess. Just messes up the kitchen and we clean it later. It's really okay. So for about every load, I put, this is kind of a big clove of garlic for a load, a small clove of garlic, a little handful of basil, a little sprinkle of salt, and then I grind it. Helps if I Now I'm going to be putting these tomatoes through a food mill. This is a really good quality food mill because I use it a lot. You can get different grades of heavy dutiness in them. This one comes with 3 sizes. So if I were doing, say, plums, and I was going to grind the giant seeds out of the plums, I would just pour one of the bigger ones in. But here I want to remove tomato seeds, which are small. If I were removing blackberry seeds, I would use this also. So this is going to take the seeds and a lot of the skin out. So I just hook this together. There we go. And put my mixture in here. It smells so good. And then grind, and it'll push the pulp through. You can get down in here where you can see. And it gathers up this material at the bottom. See the seeds? The pigs and chickens will be so happy to get that. It smells wonderful. So I'm just scraping it down a little bit here. And grinding it through. Oops. And then this is my marinara sauce. Now I can can this right away, or I can put it back in the rinsed pan and reduce it longer in the oven. If I want it to become tomato paste, I'm going to reduce it for a good long time at about 250 degrees, maybe with the convection oven on if I really want to blow the steam out of it and thicken it up till I can stand a spoon in it. But I could also just can this marinara at this level. And I'm just going to keep grinding batches, draining the water off of them, putting them through the blender, grinding them through the food grinder, the food mill, until I have enough of this to make it worth getting started on the canning process. And the canning process is what we'll do next. So we've ground through the food mill to remove the seeds and stems, and then I'm just going to scrape what's off the bottom, and I'm going to open it up and remove, you can see the pulp, the stems, the pulp and the juice have gone in there. And then this is all some large bits of basil that didn't grind down, and the skins and seeds. And we'll give those to chickens or pigs. Now, if you don't have this tool, you can take the material that you've put through the blender and you can grind it through a strainer, and it's a ladle, works well to push that through. But you need a willing participant, a couple of friends over, because it's just going to take a lot longer to get that material through there. But it'll still do the job. So today we're canning in pint jars. We want to really inspect our jars carefully. We want to make sure there are no chips or cracks, and you really want to go over the lip with your finger. Occasionally a jar has a manufacturing defect where it's got a little divot in it and then it won't take a seal. And sometimes they get chipped at the edge. Don't let people bang a spoon on your canning jars to get the jam off the spoon. It just weakens your jars. And when you've made the food from scratch and you grew it and then it bursts in the canner, that's a real bummer. So you need to inspect your jars carefully. These have been thoroughly washed. They've been used before, they've been in storage. So I just washed them and now I have them upside down to drain, and I know I haven't scalded them yet because they're upside down. So here's another hot tip. Here's the sponges that I washed them with. If the sponge is intact, that's a dish sponge. When the corner's cut off, that's a counter sponge. If two corners are cut off, it goes to the bathroom and it never comes back to the kitchen. So that's how I know how fresh or old the sponges are. It doesn't matter what color they are, those two just happen to be the same color, but we found that cutting the corner off method really helps us keep a sponge that's been used to wipe the table being then used for dishes. So this is the tool that we're going to use for scalding our jars. I just call it a grabber. It might have another name somewhere in the world. So it goes like this, and I dip it down into the hot water, and I'm putting it all, this water was just boiling. It was crazy boiling a moment ago. So what we're doing is we're scalding these jars, and that serves two purposes. One is it sterilizes the jar, and the other is it brings the jar up to a hot temperature because we're going to fill the jar with hot food. And one of the things that will make glass break is thermal shock. So we don't want the jar to be shocked by a temperature change. So we want them to be hot. Some canning recipes will tell you to keep your jars in a low oven before you fill them. I just work promptly and don't worry too much about that. So I'm going to scald each of my jars. And then we're going to be filling them. And for that, I'm going to use the canning funnel. This is a tremendously helpful tool. I use it all the time. Each tool that I use to process the food, I'm going to dip into the scalding water. They're already clean, but I'm just sanitizing them that much more. And then we're going to be fitting them with lids. So these are ball canner lids. Jars generally come in two sizes. There's the wide mouth jar, and there's what's called the regular mouth jar. So there are different size lids and rings. The sealant on the inside of the lid needs to be fresh and new to get a good seal. This is an old lid. I'll use this on a jar for dried herbs or a jar of raisins that I'm putting in the pantry, but I won't use this to can again because the sealant has already taken its impression. If I were really stuck, I'd probably try using it again and it would probably work. But after all the investment that I'm putting into this, I'm going to go ahead and use a nice fresh lid. And then these rings screw down to hold the lid in place during the canning process. You only want it fingertip tight. You're not cranking down on it because air needs to come out of the jar, so we don't need it to be super tight. And then a lid like this one, you can see that it got damaged being opened with a can popper, and you definitely would not want to use that for canning because you're not going to get a good seal. There are other types of lids, Tatler lids. They have a separate rubber ring and a plastic disc that goes on the top and can be reused several times. you want to use fresh rubber rings, but you can reuse those lids a lot. So if you're concerned about the waste factor involved here, which after enough canning does start to get significant. So we dip all of the jars and we get them scalded. And then in a moment we're going to be putting the sauce in the jars, and then I'll show you the different canners, and then we'll put them in the can. Does anybody need rings? Because I have a lot of rings. So these are the rings, and I'm setting them down in the water. And I can usually use a bigger pot, so there we go. And those are going to scald for a few moments. And when I scald the lids, it also softens the sealant. They make a nifty little tool with a magnet on the end that you can stick down in here to pull things out. I don't happen to have one. Stocking stuffer idea for Kate. So I get those all sort of melty, and I'll bring them out and set them on the tray. And let them drain a moment. All right, so we're going to put the sauce in the jars now. As I said, each thing that I use, I'm going to dip in the boiling water, and I've already dipped the canning funnel. So I'm going to put some sauce in here, and I'm going to leave headspace. Headspace is important because the contents of the jar are going to expand during the canning process, and we really don't want too much of it to vacate out of the jar. Also, if the tomatoes that you're using haven't been thoroughly cooked, if for some reason you decide to do a raw pack, which we're not going to get into that right now, but there's a lot more pectin in those tomatoes, and they'll make a lot of foam and bubble up. So it really works better to do them hot pack anyway. So I'm going to leave headspace on each of these jars. That's about enough headspace, I think. And then for each one, I'm going to wipe it with a cloth that I've dipped in the hot water. And oh, look, a brand new clean cloth that I put on my apron. So I'm going to wipe each one. These are very clean, but you really want to make sure there's no sauce residue or bits of anything on this place where the rim is going to meet with the sealant. So I'm going to take one of these and put it on here. And I'm going to put on the lid, again, fingertip tight. So just like that. I don't want to crank down on it. Don't let Mark do this, because then they're too tight. We call him iron hands. And so I'll fill each of these jars and seal each of these jars. Okay, so we filled our jars. This is a small batch. It's just a demonstration batch. Normally, if I were going to do pints, I'd have about 14 of them. That would be a full tall canner load, or 7 quarts. I have 3 types of canners here. This is a steam canner. 7-quart jars or 7 pints can fit on this rack. We fill it with hot water until just below the rack, and then cover it. Make sure that the steam ports aren't pointing at any people or something that would be damaged by steam, like your woodwork. And then get it boiling, and when there's good heads of steam shooting out both of those holes, we start timing the processing time. Processing times are going to vary. We'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. This is a water bath canner. In the water bath canner, there is a rack. The rack holds the jars off of the floor of the canner, and also it can be lifted up to pull the jars out and let them drain. In the water bath canner, we will put water over the jars. And what will happen there is that the air will express out of the jar, creating a vacuum seal. Water bath canning and steam canning are appropriate for high acid foods. This is very important. You want to make sure that you're only putting high acid foods in these canners, something like dilly beans or pickles or jams and jellies or tomato sauces. The number of pH that professional canners use is 4.6. Any number lower than that, and therefore higher acid, is safe for kettle canning. Any number lower than that needs to go in a pressure canner. I'll show you the pressure canner in a moment. The reason for needing to pressure can is that botulism is a spore that lives in the soil, and it's really there, and you'll probably never encounter it as long as you live, but if you do, it could be the end of your living. So you need to pressure can because botulism spores grow and reproduce and create their botulinum toxin in oxygen-free environments of low acid. And that's what a jar of home canned soup is. It's a low an oxygen-free anaerobic environment that has a low acid content in it. So the way to kill those botulism spores is to get the temperature of the food that you're canning up to 240 degrees. But most of that food consists of liquid, and we know that boiling point of liquid in American measurement system is 212 degrees. So we can't get liquid hotter than 212 degrees at normal atmospheric pressure. So we have to increase the pressure in order to increase the temperature. And that's what we do with the pressure canner. So I'll show that to you. So this is a pressure canner. It has a serious locking mechanism. It's very heavy aluminum. A lot of pressure builds up in here. This is the dial and the gauge to it. Every year or every other year, I take it to good old Hazel in town, and she's a master canner and preserver, and she tests the gauge. So this is my documentation to tell me that my gauge is accurate, and when it's telling me I have 10 pounds of pressure here, I really do. There is a rubber seal inside here, and every 4 or 5 uses, and certainly at the beginning of the season, I take it out and rub it all over with a light oil, like maybe a canola oil, and that keeps it from getting to where it cracks and won't hold a seal anymore. So there's a floor to this canner also. With any of the canning methods, we want to keep the jars away from direct heat. So this little floor just keeps the jars up out of heat. And then we put about 3 or 4 quarts of boiling water into this canner. The canner will come with some instructions. You can also Google it. If I want to know if my sauce is acid enough to can, I can test it with test strips. But if it's even slightly in question, if it's even marginal, it needs to be pressure canned. The folks at the Ball Blue Book Cannery will just pop their cork at the idea of you testing with your pH if it's on the iffy side. You absolutely want to go ahead and pressure can if there's any question. So this is straight up marinara sauce, and I know from experience this is quite acid enough to water bath can. If I were to mix a whole lot of other vegetables into it, a whole bunch of zucchini, a whole bunch of grilled peppers, maybe celery and onions, if I'm going to make a mixed soup, I could be getting into the danger zone with the amount of acid that's in here. And at that point, I definitely want to pressure can. I pressure can mixed soups. I pressure can chicken stock. There's a lot of different things that I put through the pressure canner. So for this tomato sauce, this is overkill. I absolutely can do it in here, and for years this was really the only canner I had. And there's no problem with that. But see, it's a lot of kind of futzing. So, but when we do this, when we get it going and the food is in there, we lock it closed, and it's always this kind of little dance, like, oh, there it is, that was better than usual. We lock it closed and put it on the heat with the food in there, and after a while, a head of steam starts escaping from here. And then, when there's a good head of steam coming up, we put the weight on it. Some of the canners have a solid piece weight, and then I would adjust the pressure by adjusting the temperature, how much heat is under it. This one is a piece weight, so it comes apart. This is 5 pounds of pressure, so it's going to take 5 pounds of steam pressure in this pot to make this go jiggle jiggle. Here's 10 pounds of pressure, and here's 15 pounds of pressure. When the pressure starts coming up, this little unit is going to pop up, And then that's going to tell me that I've got a good seal. And then I'm going to wait until the pressure gauge is coming up to where this indicates, and it starts going. It's dancing on there, and that's when I start timing. So timing is, you're going to look up a recipe and you're going to be timing it according to the size and the contents. A book like Stocking Up or the Ball Blue Book are super helpful. They're going to have a lot of different recipes in them and then give you the processing times. If I were processing these pints in here right now, knowing that they are a high acid food, I might process them for 20 minutes at 10 pounds of pressure. If I were doing a mixed chicken soup, and I know that's a low acid food and it has a whole lot of vegetables from the garden, I'm gonna kind of cook the snot out of it. I'm gonna pressure can that for 15 pounds of pressure for 45, 50 minutes. Because I really want to make sure that all the way through there it got thoroughly heated up to 240 degrees. I would not recommend doing really thick foods in a home canner. I wouldn't do meat and bean chilies that are, or anything that's a really thick paste, thicker than a tomato paste, because I can't know that that 240 degrees is going to permeate all the way through that food. And you really don't fool around with botulism. So a couple of times every year, somebody gets botulism poisoning. And what you should watch for is if you eat home canned goods and you start to feel numb, your mouth gets numb. What botulism toxin is a paralytic. That's why they inject it into models to make their face a certain way. It's a toxin and it's a paralytic. So the danger of it is that it can paralyze the respiratory system. So a person can die from botulism toxin paralyzing their ability to breathe. So if a person eats home canned food and gets their mouth numb and tingly and kind of slurring speech, it's time to call the ambulance, because they do have antitoxin at the hospital. It's kept at all hospitals, really. It's not a common occurrence, but it's a serious danger of improperly home canned foods. So if someone is offering you their home canned soup, you can just politely chat about canning and ask them if it was pressure canned or water bath canned. And I really don't recommend water bath canning things that have a low acid point. Okay. So I'm pouring water into the steam canner. I've selected the steam canner for this sauce. And I'm going to place it on the stove. And I'm going to put my jars on it. You can see that the jar has this lid here, and that with that popper, and that'll indicate to us when the jars have taken their seal properly. So all I need to do here is put them on here and cover the canner and put the heat under it and wait. I'm going to make sure that these steam vents are not pointed at any person or someone walking by, and they're not pointed at my nice woodwork. You want to have a good outpouring of steam from either hole, from the two holes at the same time. And then that tells you that the steam is thoroughly surrounding the jars, and that's when I'll start setting my timer. So I'll probably I'm going to give these 30 minutes, because they're pints. I would do longer for quarts. So this is a finished jar. This one is cool now. When the time is up, I'm going to turn the canner off and I'm going to let it cool down undisturbed on its own. When I open it, I'm going to look and see if these buttons are pushed down. I'm not going to push them down. I'll hear as it cools the sound of them popping down. That's a great sound. I don't want to push them. If I have to push it, that means it didn't really get a good seal. If something hasn't sealed properly and it didn't suck down this little divot in the top, I will refrigerate it and use it right away. Or I might even, since I'm doing batch after batch of tomato sauce for several days, I'll refrigerate it and add it to another batch and mix it in. But I don't want to put it on the shelf unless that's really sealed. And so I'm not going to disturb it. Same with the pressure canner. When the pressure canner is done, I will just turn the heat off under it, and it's not safe to open a pressure canner until the steam has subsided and the pressure has released on its own. So I will just leave it there to cool. And then as soon as it's cool, I'll open it up and check to make sure that things have sealed. So here are some different finished canned goods. This is the type of marinara sauce that we made today. This is a tomato paste. You can see that it is very thick. You can turn it upside down. You could stand a spoon in that before I got going. And this is another jar of tomato sauce. This one has a lot of headspace. It either evacuated some material in the canner or it might have been the last jar that we filled and it just might not have been all the way as full. I like to label my jars with the blue tape. They make all kinds of fancy labels, but the reason I like the blue tape is it peels off without leaving a bunch of residue behind, and I'm over it, scrubbing the labels off of things. This is a sun gold tomato relish that we made. So this is cherry tomatoes cut in half and tossed with a whole bunch of rosemary, some sea salt, some garlic, and then roasted in the oven until it cooks down and then canned as a relish. I pressure can this. I probably could water bath can it, but when I'm in doubt, I'm gonna go the pressure can route. I'm not losing anything by doing that. This is a salsa verde. This was water bath canned. It's plenty acidic. It's got tomatillos and ground cherries from our garden and red peppers from our garden. It's got cilantro in it. I find it very hard to grow cilantro at the same time of year that I have tomatoes. So I throw a lot of cilantro seed around the garden in the fall. And in about May, I have enough cilantro to choke a tomatillo. So I pull it out and make a cilantro pesto. I wash it and spin it and put it in the food processor with some olive oil and some toasted cumin and a little sea salt. And I make a paste that I then freeze. So then when I'm making the salsa, I just have the cilantro stuff at the ready because it's frustrating that the cilantro doesn't want to be abundant in the garden at the same time as the tomatoes. These are soups that I have pressure canned. They get a lot of time in the pressure canner and I make sure that they really have good seals on them. This one is a clam chowder. It's a Manhattan clam chowder, a tomato-based clam chowder. It's got all kinds of vegetables from my garden. The only things in here that are not from my garden are the sea salt, the celery, and the clams. Everything else is just a celebration of what grows in the garden. This one is a tortilla soup. It's a rich, rich chicken stock, lots of zucchini, tomatillos, corn, onions, and then when we serve this, we will heat it up and crumble corn tortillas over the top and put a little Monterey Jack on there and melt it. These are so great to have in the pantry for those winter nights when I came home from work and I don't know what to do for dinner. We've got food that's right out of the garden. This is a French onion soup in a rich beef stock, and we will put this in little ramekins in the oven with a piece of sourdough toast and some Munster on top, and it's totally yummy and delicious. It's very rich and filling. So we make all kinds of different canned items. This time of year you can pretty much find me toiling away in the kitchen, and then it's so convenient to have these things at the ready. This is the Stocking Up book. It has all kinds of processing times, so you can look up different items and get a sense of how long you should process quarts or pints of each item, and that's very helpful. It also has a lot of recipes in it, a lot of fun things to do with food you're trying to use up. 10,000 ways to eat zucchini. And then there's also the Ball Blue Book, which is kind of a canning Bible, and I don't know where mine is. I loaned it out, so if you have my Ball Blue Book, trot it on back sometime soon, please. Thanks for joining us today.
Spiral Living Center is a 501c3 nonprofit committed to promoting sustainable living skills in the Illinois Valley since 2006. For more info on our work, visit spiralliving.org.